So in this video, we are going to continue our testing journey. And in particular, we now, after already testing the domain model and the JPA interactions and the validation, let's take a look on how to test the UI layer that we already created. So the story would go like this. As a developer, I want to ensure the customer entities or entries appear in the customer list when they are stored in the database, so that I can be sure to not introduce some bug in the loading of the data. So let's see how we can actually achieve that. Currently I'm running version 1.1.2 of Jmix, which currently has some support for web UI testing, but not so much. In this version 1.2 it will actually switch, and there will be an introduction to a new feature for proper JUnit support for integration testing on the web layer or on the Vardin layer, let's say. So yeah, this is what we are going to do. So the first thing is that we need to temporarily switch to the 1.2.snapshot. And for that, we also need to change the Maven repo, because it's currently not in this global repository here, but instead in this repository nexus.jmix.io. And the dependency that we need to add, this is called test-assist. So I will just copy it in here. It's jmix-ui-test-assist, and this will give us in particular a little bit of infrastructure source code to spin up the Vardin environment and so on. Yeah, okay. So the Jmix Studio plugin says it's not supporting 1.2.0 snapshot. This is fine for me. I will just leave it as is. It should probably just work, continue to work just fine. And with that, now our Maven dependency, we actually have one new annotation, and this is called UI test. And this should be here in this test assist. Let's take a look at this one. And in the documentation, they already show how to interact with that. So you annotate your test class with @UI test, and then you give it some information, for example, the main screen ID and also the base package of the screen that you would want to test. So let's give that a try actually. When we go here now to our customer browse screen, so this is where we want to test something that it's actually, if we go to this to the XML definition here, that for example this loader has been properly configured and is connected to the table and all of this stuff. So with that here, let's create a test class which is just JUnit 5 customer browse test. This is just fine. And then what we will do is to basically say we want to have this particular test being, first of all, a Spring Boot test. Second of all, it should be a UI test. And there then we have this authenticated user. It will be admin. Then we have the main screen ID, and this is we can look up here in main screen.java. So this will be this string. So this will be our main screen ID, and the base package should be the David's jmix-ui-test. So this, it's probably not exactly the base path of this particular screen, but if we just take it to this one, then it should actually load all of the screens in. So probably for now this is just fine. And then we also want to configure a context configuration. And this context configuration means that it basically says to the Spring which configuration classes it should load. And first of all, we want our rent your stuff application. this is just our regular Spring Boot application class that generally starts the application and defines a couple of beans. And then the second thing is that we also need to say UI-test-assist configuration class. So this also needs to be in there. And yeah, with that we can write our first test. So let's say, yeah, we could say given one customer exists when open customer browse, then table contains the customer, or something along those lines. Okay, so how do we now actually achieve that? So the first thing is that, as you might have already seen in this annotation here, there is a parameter that you can inject into your test case, and this is a JUnit 5 feature where you can basically inject particular parameters into your test. And in this case, we can just take the screens dependency here, and this is just a regular one from Jmix, the screens API, and with that we can basically say we would like to create a particular class. In this case, we can say customer browse.class, and what we get back is our customer browse screen. And when we do show, then we can basically now open up this screen, and yeah, so then it would probably be helpful to do some kind of assertion, and this could be, for example, we have another API in screens which is get open screens, I think, and then get active screens. Yes, exactly. And here we get a list back or a collection back of open screens. So we could say stream find first or throw. With that, it should give us like the first entry in this list. And then what we can do is, for example, just the customer browse screen. So let's see if this already works. This is not yet exactly what we have written here, but we will get to that in a second. Okay, so this worked. So the test, correctly verified that the screen is actually the one that we expected it to be. Like, we could also do a negative one by checking that not is equal to, but instance of, and then we could say customer edit, for example, and with that we should see that it's actually failing, because the active screen is not an instance of customer edit, but instead it's an instance of customer browse. So okay, so test is failing now, so this is fine. Good, then we already have generally set up the way how to interact with this UI screens. And just conceptually, what happens here is now that it basically spins up all the front-end part, but not in the browser as normally it is going to be done when it's about UI testing, that actually like in browser is spun up, and then there's some clicking going on or something. Here we basically cut off at this Vardin layer and have all the JMix and Vardin APIs in place. And everything before that is not actually executed. So this means it still covers probably like 90-95% of the cases that you would want to test in your user interface, but it's not everything that the browser normally renders. Okay, so yeah, with that we already have our first step, and now what we want is probably to check if the customer has some particular data in it. So what we can do here is to say customer browse get window, and get window has a method called get component, and with that component method we can basically get some proper JMix or Vaadin component into our test in order to interact with those. And the ID is actually the ID. If we go here and take a look at the UI definition here, these IDs that we configure for the different components that we use. So this means if I now search for customer component and I'm sorry, customer table, then this should already work and I would be able to retrieve that. But as you might have seen here, the get component normally returns a component object. So this is like very up in the hierarchy of these UI component classes, which is fine to even just retrieve it, but in order to interact with the API of the table component, it's not really useful. So instead we will convert that into a table of type customer. And yes, this will be going to be a table from JMix. And what you now have to do is to cast that into a particular table of type customer. Luckily, we know that this is how it's how it should be. So it's not a real problem, but casting is oftentimes not so easy. So let's see how we afterwards can refactor the test case in order to make it a little bit more good reading. So what we can now do is customers table get items, and this will return us the items that are currently rendered in the table, and this gives us an object of type table items, and this has another method called get items, and this gives us actually a collection of customer objects. So with that we could say that this is going to be customers, and what now we could, for example, assert that customers or probably we can take the first one here, and then probably the next thing is that we would like to search for the first name, and then we can do some comparison. Let's just check that and see if the data is loaded, and hopefully the test will actually fail, because as you might already see, we are just checking for a particular item in the table which should have been loaded from the database, but we have not put it into the database. And this is actually one difference compared to how the Kuba layer UI testing worked, because there it was that the database is not actually touched, and instead you have to mock out the interaction with the database. With JMix this changed a little bit, because it actually will go into the configured database of the Java application and load all the data. So in this case it's a real almost like an end-to-end test, because you have the UI layer, let's say to as I said, like 80-90%, and then you also cover the database interactions with that test case. And yeah, so this means, okay, now we actually expected Foo, but it was Mario, which is actually even more interesting, because we didn't even put Mario into this into the database here in the test. So let's take a look on how this works. With our current configuration, it will basically just use our random or regular application configuration, and this will just go into our production code and take a look at the application properties, and we'll take this configuration here. And this means that when we run this test, it will actually use the same database as if we run our Jmix application locally against our Postgres database, and it will share the same data. And this is generally a problem for test cases because, like you just imagine this situation, we just entered something in our test environment here locally when we started our application, and all of a sudden our test breaks. And furthermore, like if you expect something to be there in the database, then it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually, for example, in the CI system, it's not necessarily there. So let's fix that. And in order to fix that, there are a couple of ways how to do it. I'm not sure about the best one, but I can show you one that I have seen working. So first of all, we could just, for our test class, configure a different database configuration, basically the data source bean that we have configured here. If we just change those and point to a different Postgres database, then it would also create this database accordingly and so on. So this would be the first option. I decided for now to go in a different route, just to show you a little bit of what Spring testing or Spring Boot testing is actually capable of doing. So there's an annotation called auto-configure test database. This comes from Spring Boot, and this will spin up a test database on the fly for us for this particular UI test. And the way this works is that we have to put a particular dependency into our build Gradle, which is actually a test, an embeddable test database. So if we go here in our build Gradle right now, we only have the dependency to Postgres, which is fine for production code and also for our other test that we are actually where we interact with the database. But what we also can additionally do is to create another dependency for HSQL into our test implementation, basically in the dependency tree. And together with this dependency, Spring Boot will basically, with the help of this annotation, it will pick up, like on the fly, create a new database and then interact with that instead of the real one. So this means if we now say, normally our test should have passed if we pass in here Mario, because against our current database, it was actually Mario. If I now change that, or adjust the expectation here to actually be Mario, then it should still not work. And the reason for that is that now we have a fresh database. And in this fresh database, there is actually no data at all. So instead of saying, so this is why this assertion now fails, it actually causes a problem here because of this one here, because there is no find first, there's no result, because this converts an optional into, or this is an optional, and then the or else throw converts it either into a customer object or throws an exception. And this is just this exception, no such element exception here. So this means what we now can do is to set up our test data. So for that we can auto-wired. We can first of all create our dataManager, and then the next thing is that we could say we would like to have a setup method, and in the setup method we will just create a customer object, exactly. Let's create this customer here. And then we say it will be foo. And the last name will be bar. And then email we don't actually need, but probably what we also need is that we have to create this address here. So this will be our address class, and let me just create an instance of that as well. And here we set okay. So by doing that, it should actually be possible to search for this first entry here. So let's try this one. Okay, as we now see, there's the first entry, which is called foo as the first name. If we now try to run that a second time and create a second test, it will actually create problems because when we create another instance and in the second test want to check for another instance, then this first instance is still there because this annotation just creates on the fly one database for the whole test suite. So this means what we have to do is we have to clean up our customer, and we do that actually. So this is actually the reason why I initially put this into the setup. And what we now can do is, instead of making it a variable inside this method, we can also make it a field inside this class. And now we have a reference to this customer. We still save it in the same way, but after we are done, we create a teardown method, which will, at the end of the test, independent if the test succeeded or not, it will perform this task. And what we can here say is just do a removal of this customer. And this is generally a good idea to, just clean up everything in every test that you have done, in order to not, have some side effects on some other tests that you are interacting with. So, all right, with that we could now go ahead and create a new test case. So first of all, our data loading is now present. So perhaps first of all, we can refactor that a little bit here. So let's create a method called open customer browse, because this is probably something that we would want to have more often. Second one would be here to just encapsulate this component fetching into another method called customer table. And then probably what we can also make here is to say customer table items, or we could also say loaded customers. So this means now our test goes like this. Given we open the browse screen, and then it would be expect our customers. The first name of the first customer that we find is equal to foo. Perhaps let's, instead of making this here appearing all the time, we can also first of all create a variable and say first customer, and then we can probably create another method which is called first loaded customer, and then we can rename it here, And here we will inline this because we don't need this variable anymore. We can inline this one as well. Perhaps we can even inline this one. So, okay, let's see if our test still runs. And if this is the case, then we can create a second test case. Probably another thing is that here it's just saying foo, but actually if you just read the test, it's a little bit hard to understand where this is coming from, foo. So what we probably can do is, instead of, so the association is to this particular string here, but what we can also do is to say that we actually reference the customer object here, but this requires us to change the variable name once again. So this would be the first customer, and then we could say customer get first name. So with that, we have verified that the first customer here is actually the one that we have checked here. We could also directly check on the objects. This would also be fine. Perhaps it's even better to just do it like this. Okay, so test still passing. So this means we can even inline this one, and now we have like quite a concise test to see, we open the customer browser, and then the first loaded customer of this customer browser is equal to our customer that we created initially. Okay, so then with that, we can just have a second test case, which is probably, just, well, or perhaps we actually don't do that as part of this video, but instead keep this next test case for a second video. All right, so then let's create a branch. And if you might wonder what this is now all about, why do we actually test this kinds of stuff, because this was just generated code and so on. So this, I'm struggling normally to find a proper balance between testing stuff that has been generated from Jmix or from the studio versus just keeping it like that. At the end of the day, our end users, they do not really care if we have generated the source code or not. The only thing that they care about is that it's working. And since this is generated code, it means you can, accidentally just, do something wrong, and then all of a sudden your application doesn't work anymore. So, for example, I could say first name. Let's say if we change our data loading definition like this, and if we now run our test again, then we will probably see that it stops working. And this is actually, the beauty of this whole effort is that it will prevent us from making any kind of problematic change in our XML or in our in our definition of the UI. And this verification has a lot of value from my perspective. So here now we saw, okay, so it was actually broken because I only asked for customers that have not the first name foo. So then it all of a sudden broke, and now we changed it back, and it all of a sudden works again. So with that, we should be done with our with our story here. You know, was about the loading of the data. This we have verified. So let's merge that. Should fix this 18. Let's just double check this one. Yes, it is. The tests are still running, but I will probably merge it anyways because it's in the main branch and we've seen it working. Here you can actually see it is actually working even in the CI system. All right, then let's merge this and close the story and see you in the next video.